In the twilight of prohibition, as these final weeks burn down toward legalization, you might think Canada's longest-serving cannabis prisoner would have something to say. On Facebook or Twitter, on TV or on your phone, even. You might expect at least a few tellings of the nearly forgotten yet jaw-dropping exploits of Robert "Rosie" Robotham, who spent decades of his life in a defiantly pitched battle against the law that is about to expire October 17. Robert "Rosie" Robotham served 20 years in jail for cannabis smuggling. Now 67, he talks about the past and ponders the future as legalization looms. Richard Loughton's Toronto Star, "I believe that marijuana enlightens the mind," Robert "Rosie" Robotham told a judge after he was convicted in May 1977 for conspiracy to smuggle hashish. In 1985, Robotham was again convicted for marijuana smuggling and sentenced to 20 years in jail. No one person can claim martyrdom for Canadian marijuana reform. But when it comes to audacious cannabis crime resulting in brutally hard time, nobody took bigger chances with sheer tonnage, nor paid a heavier price for it, than Toronto's Robotham. Where others involved in the hippie-era drug trade laid low, the flamboyant Robotham was defiant to a fault. With each life-altering bust he would take his punishment with explosive speeches to the court, declaring the law an ass and vowing to carry on upon his release. At his peak as a world-class smuggler based in Toronto, Rosie had big names on his side: two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author Norman Mailer, in 1977, and singer-songwriter Neil Young in 1985, each stood in the witness box speaking in his defense as sentencing loomed. Article continued below. Mailer described Robotham as equal parts swashbuckling Errol Flynn and for the people Robin Hood, saying locking him up would be bad for the cosmos. Young, whose brother Bob was among the co-defendants in 85, stressed that Robotham's Toronto network drew a moral line of trading only in cannabis. "And the only thing wrong with that," said Young, "is that the government's not getting its share." Read more. Countdown to cannabis, the case for amnesty. Privately run cannabis stores are best way to curb black market. Ontario Tories say marijuana advocates eager for cannabis tourism in Canada, but uncertainty looms over how it'll look and what a share it would have been. Robotham's last bust involved a staggering £15,500 of high-grade Lebanese hashish, smuggled from the Bekaa Valley in the midst of a civil war, cloaked by crates of dates and sailed out of a naval blockade of Beirut, and eventually brought by stealth to Canada. Street value, $50 million. "I believe that marijuana enlightens the mind," Robert "Rosie" Robotham told a judge after he was convicted in May 1977 for conspiracy to smuggle hashish. In 1985, Robotham was again convicted for marijuana smuggling and sentenced to 20 years in jail. It all added up to 20 years in prison, 5 times longer than Vancouver activist, entrepreneur Mark Emery, who is routinely referred to as Canada's Prince of Pot. Article continued below. Even as former police and politicians switch sides, assuming executive positions intent upon harvesting a soon-to-be legal Canadian cannabis market that one StatScan analysis estimates will be worth $6 billion annually, Robotham is off the radar. This week we found out why. It turns out Robotham, now 67 and very much a free man, is not on Facebook or Twitter, or anything else. He doesn't even have an email address. After so many years under police surveillance, he values privacy foremost. He is artfully unplugged, but Robotham made an exception when the star came knocking. Over the course of 3 hours at his modest bungalow in North Toronto, he pulled back the veil on how he feels now, on the cusp of a change that consumed much of his life. "The first thing I want to say is I absolutely am not interested in sympathy. Nobody owes me anything. I never back down from a fight and that's all on me. As far as regrets go, I have only one: my children. I failed them. I wasn't there, and I wasn't able to provide. Eventually, I was able to reach them and explain my part in this cannabis war. Life throws curveballs when you least expect it." Robotham and his partner Megan have a cozy home now, bursting with the infectious smile of a 9-month-old baby girl, Mia Rose. The children he sired as a younger man, 2 girls and 2 boys, survived and eventually thrived in his absence, and he is grateful to have grown closer to them as adults. But his new daughter offers a second chance at full parenthood, and so now he finds himself watching his sugar intake, drinking tea and making doctor's appointments, determined to be there for the girl as long as he can. Look at me now, drinking tea. I'm a teetotaler. But I love it. Robotham's still close to Neil Young's brother Bob, who drops by several times a week to visit the family. He picked up the nickname Rosie as a boy and says he's looking forward to the word games he can play with the baby when she starts talking. Hey me a Rose, too, if it all seems a world removed from the one he once knew. Robotham shrugs. He still remembers. He's willing to share, albeit with a tinge of caution, because there are some things he knows from back in the day that perhaps could still do him harm. With a baby on board, he warns that whatever you write, don't put a bull's eye on my forehead. Long story short, Rosie was born and raised in Belleville to a family of devout Anglicans. His dad and grandfather fought in the First and Second World Wars, conflicts Robotham learned more about when he spent part of his second long imprisonment as a student, earning a history degree. But his war was cannabis. And it was at Toronto's Rockdale College, epicenter of the Toronto hippie scene, where he first did battle. Long hair, free love, no rules. Small bags to start. And then, just like that, huge amounts. He struggles today to even explain how easily he came to oversee a network that at one point was able to import and distribute as much as 1,000 pounds of hashish a week, coast to coast. Honesty was key. People were getting scammed with garbage and they soon learned they could come to me and it was the real thing. I guess I just had a knack. It's almost like I'm Savon or something. I don't know why I was so good at it. Partly it was luck, and, dear reader, you can decide whether good or bad. Robotham recalls a pivotal moment in the early 70s. He was standing with a friend in front of a when he was approached by a man in a tidy suit and fedora, asking, "Are you Rosie Robotham?" The man then pointed to a car where 2 other men, similarly attired, stood waiting. "We have business to discuss," one said. They were Lebanese businessmen and already they knew everything there was to know about Robotham. They handed him a key to a car they said was parked outside Varsity Stadium. The trunk was filled with a ton of hashish. "We know you can do this. Sell it for us." He asked how to contact them. "You won't find us, we'll find you." With that, Robotham entered through the rarest of portals, into a world of serious tonnage. His ability to secure, smuggle and distribute in ever-increasing quantities continued for the better part of a decade until 1982, when the Toronto Police Drug Squad unleashed Operation Rose, a $6 million effort, all told, that ended with Rosie and nearly 60 others in custody, awaiting the trial that would see Neil Young arrive in a plea for clemency. At his first trial, just before he was sentenced to 14 years in prison, Robotham heaped scorn upon the court in blistering remarks that lasted well over an hour, accusing the Canadian authorities of meekly falling in line with U.S. drug policy and insisting that the only moral stand is open defiance against a law that does more harm than the weed it is intended to suppress. "I didn't break God's law and you people spend millions of dollars over a plant that grows out of the ground. Through my culture I tried to make the new world." Remember the Beatles songs? Maybe we're dreamers, maybe we're idealists. Though Robotham has told this story a few times before, there's new information in circulation. Robotham's primary stateside partner, Richard Stratton, who spent 8 years in a U.S. prison for his part in the gigantic 15,500 lb. shipment of Bekaa Valley hashish 2 years ago, told his version of events in Smuggler's Blues, a true story of the hippie mafia. Stratton details how he first came to Rockdale and fell in with Robotham as a brother-in-arms and how together they were responsible for vast amounts of high-quality Lebanese hashish entering North America. It was Stratton who was on the Beirut end of that fateful final shipment, arranging payments so soldiers would turn a blind eye at checkpoints and allow the load to make its way from the plantations in the Bekaa Valley to the port. In that moment, Stratton was a peacenik in a Lebanese civil war. One especially audacious twist, all the slabs of hash had the Stratton, Rosie freak family imprint all over it, our telltale stamp, both marketing contrivance and slap in the face to authorities. Stratton, like Robotham, presents theirs as the decidedly non-violent end of the business. They traded only in cannabis and never with guns. But in Smuggler's Blues, Stratton, a Boston native, describes how he was confronted by the New York Mafia with an ultimatum: share or be killed. He further claims he was rescued from the crisis by none other than Whitey Bulger, the boss of Boston's Winter Hill crime gang, who extended his protection, effectively saving him. Robotham cautions not to believe it all. I love Stratton, but I think there's a bit of creative license happening there. I will say this, the Mafia Part 1 believe is true. And I will say, we never had anything like that on the Canadian side of the family. There were a few tensions in those days, but nothing serious. When you are successful, of course others want to take what you have. We were able to stand up to the few challenges that came. I do remember one time, the Vagabonds motorcycle club pulled up outside my place. It was my birthday, 4 bikes in the front and 4 in the back with a limousine in the middle. The door opened and the club president stepped out with a birthday cake. We just want to pay our respects. We have no problem with you. Happy birthday, that was it. They got back in and rode away. Stratton describes himself as addicted to the adventure of the smuggle as much as anything. Cat and mouse games, with police trying to stay one step ahead of their world caving in. But he describes Robotham as driven by something else besides a compulsion to stand up loudly against an unjust law. Rosie, got to love that man, the marijuana martyr, done more for the herb than anyone else in the history of the nation. He glories in the role, loves to rub his defiance in their faces, Stratton writes, but he's too flamboyant. It's like he needs to get caught to validate who he is and what he does. That flamboyance, and the sheer scale of what he was smuggling, comes up when talk turns to amnesty. Rosie is resigned to the likelihood that while the Trudeau government now is making sounds about expunging the records of those convicted of minor possession, he is the last man on a Canadian cannabis conviction list that numbers as many as 500,000. Expunge all the possession records immediately. Stop the suffering all these people have endured, the shrunken lives, said Robotham, who still enjoys smoking pot, though in nowhere near the amounts he imbibed in his youth, and if that should extend to me, wonderful. But I don't see it. There were police and prosecutors that made their careers on me. They needed a boogeyman and I was handy. I was made out to be the monster, pure evil. In order for it all to fit together, if they let me, I'd love to be put in charge of the government's legal sales. It would delight me to pay every tax dollar. It would delight me to have a Canada revenue person right inside the accounting office. I'd do it right because I'd love to show the people on the other side that despite everything you've heard, I care about society too. Our kids all go to the same schools. It matters to me just as much. My message to the people who went out of their way to put me behind bars is, I forgive you all and I sentence you to be yourselves for the rest of your lives. Any of us can learn to do better with the time we have left. Everyone has lessons to learn. Mitch Potter is a Toronto-based reporter. Follow him on Twitter, @MBrights.